Introduce this morning's plenary speaker. And it is a pleasure to do so, as I think we all say, because we tend to get to introduce our friends. Lindsay's been my friend for a number of years, and actually it's a friendship that is born out of IATEFL. 5 years ago, he was in GI SIG and I was in LT SIG. And he approached me and said, shall we do a podcast? And we created this series called EdTech Concerns, which fittingly is perhaps the topic as well of today's plenary. So 5 years ago, we made these podcasts for IATEFL, and we looked at lots of different aspects of technology use and perhaps the untalked parts of technology. By the end of that series, we kind of got a podcasting bug. And so since then, we meet pretty much every week to record a podcast called The TEFL Commute, which is aimed at looking at a lighter side of teaching. If you don't know Lindsay outside of podcasting, he's written many course books, Straightforward, Global come to mind, and he's got a new course book coming out shortly with Helbling, which is called Studio, if I remember rightly. He's won lots of awards for teaching, he's written methodology books, and of course this is a talk about technology, so I asked him about technology. I know quite a bit about him with technology, but he would describe himself as an occasional blogger, reluctant Facebook user, and for some reason he also added he's been wearing a Fitbit for over a year. What you may not know about Lindsay is, apart from being a tech geek, he's a board game geek. In fact, he's just said to me, as we came up the stage, I'm more nervous now than I was trying to win the last lap of the Bahrain Grand Prix on my app. His love of gaming does spill over into ELT, though. And if you like the combination of two, then perhaps check out things he's written, like the English for the Zombie Invasion and The Island, a very mysterious PowerPoint game that he once came up with. But to close his introduction, I'll go back to our podcast, The TEFL Commute. When we start each episode, Lindsay says, this is a podcast for language teachers that's not about language teaching, but the topic might come up. So in that spirit, please welcome to the stage Lindsay Clandfield to give a technology talk that is not about technology, but the topic might come up. Lindsay.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Nice to see you all here. Thank you all for coming. Hello to everyone who's watching online. Thank you, IATEFL, for inviting me. I'm going to jump right in and start my talk on mythology, and the language of education technology with an interesting little news story I discovered. I'm going to take you back to December of 2018. This was something that I came across. It was an event that happened in Russia, in the city of Yaroslavl. Apologies if I pronounced that wrong. It was a youth technology forum called Proyektoria, and this was around 150 miles northeast of Moscow. This was a medium-sized event. There was a stage and two presenters sharing various technology-related projects with the younger audience, secondary school and university students. At one point, they brought out the pièce de résistance of the forum, a human-sized robot called Boris. The event was covered on national television, where they hailed this piece of technology as one of the most advanced robots in existence. The newsreaders said that this could serve as an inspiration to the young audience to become roboticists themselves. They got even more excited. One of the presenters announced the next part, that Boris could dance and that, quote, he's really not that bad. However, many Russian bloggers were unconvinced. They quickly began commenting on it. How was it that the country's scientists could produce such an impressive android without showing any previous results? Where had this robot come from? Why was there nothing about Boris online? Where were the sensors? And why did it look like Boris was made exactly big enough to have a human inside? The answer was, of course, that there was a human being inside. Pictures from the forum later revealed what looked like a human neck visible between his head and body. Worse still, a picture emerged of Boris the Robot, and I think this is the worst part for the poor guy, Boris the Robot being de-roboted backstage as the helmet was removed and you could see a young man underneath. It turns out that the robot was not a robot, it was a costume made by a costume company which eventually publicly recognized the product. In the end, the show and the news channel both said they had never really implied that it was a real robot and denied trying to mislead viewers. Now, we could just chalk this up to another one of those odd pieces of news stories that you find on the internet and then later on in one of my course books, maybe. Or throw it out as an example of fake news and quickly forgotten. When I came across it, though, as I was preparing for this talk, it immediately reminded me of another piece of technology, much older, but that was similarly passed off as almost unreal and magical, but not what it seemed. The automaton, also known as the mechanical Turk, or simply the Turk, or the automaton chess player, was a chess-playing machine built in the 1700s. Constructed by a Hungarian named Wolfgang van Kempelen, originally was meant to impress the Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. The robot appeared to be able to play a game of chess against any human opponent. The automaton, or the Turk as it was known, was toured around Europe and the Americas for 84 years to several of the royal courts and important places. It was able to beat many human players it played against, including illustrious opponents such as Napoleon Bonaparte and Benjamin Franklin. It was hailed as an incredible piece of technological wizardry. Until, of course, the secret eventually got out. There was a very small, hot, uncomfortable cubbyhole where a human being could hide inside the Turk. At least 5 chess masters, it has now been revealed, had been hidden inside it during its operation over nearly a century. I wanted to begin today's talk with the story of Boris the Robot and the Mechanical Turk because this is a talk about stories. It's a talk about the stories we tell and the language we use about technology. It's also about how some stories keep repeating themselves over and over again, and especially when it comes to education technology, and how much we desperately want to believe that they are true. My purpose this morning is not to attack EdTech. It's certainly not to attack people who are here giving workshops or talks on initiatives or projects that they have done with education technology. In a way, I think for many of us, EdTech has been a path to professional development. It certainly has been for me. It's been also a path for career advancement for me. In IATEFL, 15 years ago, the computer SIG was quite small before it became the learning technology SIG. It had its own small track at an IATEFL conference. I was speaking to people from the learning technology SIG who says it's increasingly difficult to decide what goes on the learning technologies SIG track at IATEFL because there are so many talks about learning technologies. As Sean mentioned in his kind introduction, I've written books about education technology. I've taught courses on it. Over the past 10 years, I've given myself lots of workshops and talks that deal with EdTech, from digitalization of course material, to videos, to blogging, to emoji, to screens, to M-learning, all kinds of stuff. My first ever IATEFL talk was in Liverpool, here, in 2004. This was the first time I had used PowerPoint. Unfortunately, nobody told me that putting in lots and lots of animations and sound effects. Remember when PowerPoint had sound effects you could add to the animations and things could whoosh in and whoosh out? No one told me that that was actually very distracting to an audience. And I rammed in all the sound effects and all the visual things just because I could. To make matters worse, this talk was called Teaching with Minimal Resources. It was not my finest moment. But even if your experience is different, Even if you haven't given talks on education technology or written blog posts or done that kind of stuff, I don't think there's any way any of us kind of escaped the influence of technology in our work over the past 15 years. Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary of the early 20th century, once famously said, "You might not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." I think we could say the same about EdTech and technology in general. So, all of this means that I'm really nervous about this talk because while it's not an attack on EdTech, it is a critique of some of the things we've been hearing, some of the things we've been repeating and saying ourselves over the past 10 years. One of the things I've noticed about any time someone gets up to make a vaguely critical talk about EdTech in ELT conferences is there's often an amount of trepidation, an amount of also wanting to prove one's cred that, in fact, I do love technology, I'm just going to say this, and proving all of that so as not to be accused of being a dinosaur or a Luddite who hates technology. And look, I've just done that myself. Before we look at the language around EdTech, it's perhaps worth looking at what I mean by the term. Lever and Livingstone, writing in the Handbook of New Media, have a very useful way of categorizing the ways we look at technology. And they categorize into 3 ways. The first is we can look at technology in terms of its artifacts and devices. That is, the technology itself, how it's designed, and how it's made. Second, we can look at activities and practices. That is, what we do with the technologies. And third, we can look at context and use, the social arrangements and organizational forms that surround the use of these technologies. When I think back to my own experience of the past decade, I wonder if I have not been focusing a lot on the first element and the second element, and probably neglecting the third element. A lot of the talk about technology and education in our field and in wider world of education recently has either been, frankly, a fetishization of devices, apps, or software and the potential they have to unlock learning. But, to be fair, there's also very frequently a plea to look at the pedagogy. Let's not forget the pedagogy. These two often combine to give us lots of blog posts along the lines of 25 things you can do with X, or how X or Y can improve your classes. Here are some examples of the things I mean. I first remember thinking about the fascination with the new in EdTech and in my work in ELT when smartphones began to become ubiquitous in 2004, 2005. I, along with many other teachers, many other writers and trainers, urged my colleagues, my fellow teachers, to look at how we could harness this technology to improve learning. A few years later, we were all talking about the hype cycle, where every new thing would come and replace another thing, then it would go down and there would be something else. Then we began to get a bit tired, I think, of the hype cycle. I remember when the Apple Watch came out, a colleague of mine, Gavin Dudney, posted on Facebook, please, please, let's not have articles about 25 ways you can use the Apple Watch in education. But we did. This is still happening. I think the latest new thing that we are writing, or some of us are writing about and sharing very interesting and new ideas, is probably voice assistants, how we could use Alexa or Siri in the classroom. There are even other things, ones that you have to be very creative to think of these ones, but ways that you can use drones in the classroom. Or finally, the smart classroom. Here's some nice quotes from this article about the smart classrooms. Imagine this: as an instructor enters the room, the classroom computer automatically logs her in. Based on that individual instructor's preferences, a browser opens and loads a specific web page. Rather than manually adjusting classroom lighting, heat, or audio levels, or physically signing into the classroom computer, the instructor uses spoken word commands to make these actions. These seems like solutions looking for problems. I'd like to make a side note here and mention a term that I came across when doing a lot of reading about tech and tech journalism. It's a term that tech journalists use called Betteridge's Law of Headlines. This law says, this is an old adage from tech journalism that says, any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered by the word no. Returning to Lever and Livingston's categorization, one thing I notice about all of these things, all of these kind of pieces, is while they may talk about the artifacts, the device, and the activities, it's rare to talk about the third element, the context in which they are to be introduced. I think it's in part our failure to do so sometimes, which explains why it's hard for so many of these things to really get taken up widely in language classrooms around the world. Another striking thing to say about EdTech in general is that the discourse surrounding it has been one, over the past decade at least, of sheer, almost breathless optimism. As the British sociologist Steve Woolgar has noted, new technology in general, the implication is that something new, different, and usually better is happening. Education technology in this respect is almost always part of a positive project. It's almost always with the best of intentions. Words, there are frequent collocates, I think, with education technology. Words like unleashing power, like unlocking the potential, like transforming lives. We talk about technology-enhanced learning. One of our earliest acronyms in technology in ELT was CALL, computer-assisted learning. This, in our field, is unlike almost any of the other things we have. Exam development doesn't get this kind of enthusiasm. Curriculum design doesn't get this enthusiasm. Teacher research doesn't quite get this enthusiasm. And course book writing doesn't get it either. There just isn't the same fervor as there is for education technology. So the first thing I want to say is that the language around education technology is almost always thought of as, quote, unquote, a good thing. This may or may not be the case. But there are other more concrete and perhaps scarier stories that we tell and are told. Let's think of these as bedtime tales for teachers. I'm going to start with what many would call the low-hanging fruit. This story, myth if you like, has been around for a while, and while many of us in our profession now admit it's not true, it's still regularly mentioned in public. It's the idea that in classrooms around the world, there are two kinds of people, digital immigrants and digital natives. The terminology was coined by the writer Mark Prensky, who in fact gave a very entertaining and very good plenary about it to IATEFL exactly 10 years ago in 2009. I don't think I really need to re-explain it to today's audience in great detail, but I'll just gloss it quickly. In a landmark paper published in 2001, Prensky argued that today's students who have grown up surrounded by digital technologies were native speakers of the digital language of computers, video games, and the internet. In contrast, those not born into the digital world were digital immigrants, aka older people. While these immigrants could learn the language of the digital world, they would be stuck with odd accents, mispronunciations, and slip-ups. The problem with education, according to this, was that the digital immigrant teachers were speaking an outdated language to a population fluent in another language. That's 2001. By the time 2008 and 2009 rolled around, and Prensky came to this conference, the metaphor was getting enough attention to be looked at critical. Here's an excerpt from a 2008 paper that reviewed a lot of the critical discourse around this. I think this metaphor, even though we might not always think it's true, has an incredible staying power. I've heard it numerous times over the past 15 years in conferences around the world, and I've probably used it more than once myself back in the day. It's also often reinforced by images of toddlers using an iPad, of 4-year-olds finding YouTube channels to watch, and of teenagers glued to their smartphones. It all fits into that same story, but it's problematic. Other writers and academics have explored this notion at length. The paper we saw, for example, found that it is particularly problematic as it stereotypes learners and teachers. This is almost always applied to teachers regardless of their age. At ELT conferences I've been to, as I'm getting older and other teachers seem to be still staying younger, I've been in audiences where we are almost all addressed as digital immigrants having to cope with our digital native learners. Although when I looked around, many of the teachers in the audience were in their early 30s and therefore had probably done a large part of their post-secondary education in a world where Google, laptop computers, and the internet existed. So one, it was problematic as it stereotyped and it put teachers usually in the category of digital immigrant. The other problem lies in assuming that being familiar with one kind of technology meant mastery over many. This is not the case. I'm sure many in the audience will be familiar with younger students of yours or younger members of your family who could find and download an illegal copy of Captain Marvel with no problem, or get the whole collection of Harry Potter books off some website. But they might not have any idea how to organize their desktop, find their files, or protect their computer against viruses. There have since been many studies that actively confront what is now called the myth of digital natives. It just doesn't seem to have any hard evidence for it. Writing in the British Journal of Education Technology, the writers Bennett, Maton, and Curvin likened some of the accounts of digital natives and digital immigrants to a form of academic moral panic. It's worth noting that Prensky himself, as recently as 2017, has been refining and elaborating on the terminology. He says it's been misinterpreted. He tries to clarify now it's not about the age, but about shifts in cultural attitudes between generations and others that came before. But I believe that the handy metaphor of teacher equals digital immigrant and learner equals digital native is still regularly invoked. It's an enduring common sense story. I don't think it does us any good, though. On the contrary, I think it's actively hurting us. For the next story, I want to bring you back to another personal story of mine. This again happened in 2018. Last year, I was at a publisher's event in Mexico. The publisher had brought some authors of their books and a well-known local teacher trainer to do events around the country. They had also invited another speaker from outside of ELT. This was an expert consultant on new technologies, a person who regularly appeared on television in Spain, where I live, to talk about the latest developments and how they might be changing society. So this is what she did on television. Her name was Sylvia Leal. She had great PowerPoint slides and no sound effects. She began her presentation by saying how something was coming, something very big. She said it was like an earthquake. It was so powerful it could move the world. But unlike an earthquake, she said to us, we could see it coming. The next image she showed was of an enormous wave. She was talking about gigantic transformations undergoing education because of technology. The talk went to look on at examples of augmented reality, virtual reality headsets, online learning, and a few other things. But I think this is a very common image as well, and one that the tech industry has enthusiastically latched onto and deployed. Predictions about the destruction of the old world and the rise of a new world, all because of technology. We've heard it invoked to herald the death of the music industry, the death of the newspaper industry, the death of the hotel industry, the death of cable TVs, the death of taxis, the death of university, all because of something called disruptive innovation, where a new and usually technology-related innovation in a field disrupts and changes the existing order. One of my favorite writers on EdTech, Audrey Waters, sums it up very nicely. She says that people seemingly love to believe in the end of the world as we know it stories, for reasons that have to do with the horrors of the now and the heaven of the future. Many cultures, and she stresses that Silicon Valley is a culture despite all the tech and science, tell a story that predicts some sort of cataclysmic event that will bring about radical cultural, economic, political transformation, and eventually paradise. An example in education of disruptive innovation that would supposedly wipe away everything in its path was the MOOC, or Massively Open Online Course. These captured the imagination in the 2000s and 10s, where top-tier universities like MIT or Stanford began offering massive online courses free. Soon it was being predicted that this would end university as we know it, and that there would be only 10 universities left in the US. That would mean by 2021 or 2022. Everyone started talking about taking MOOCs, setting up MOOCs and running MOOCs. Fast forward 8 years later, and MOOCs are still around, but they haven't been the game-changer, disruptive tsunami they were set up to be, I don't think. There are MOOCs for English language learners. There are some good MOOCs for English language teachers, but there's no evidence that these are really destroying all face-to-face classes everywhere, in any market particularly. There does seem to be some evidence that one of the big problems with MOOCs is that people don't usually finish them, and it's hard to keep them free unless you really don't mind losing money over the long run. Speaking personally, the notion of disruption has never been more ever-present in my own professional life as it has been with books. Just as records, cassettes, and CDs, print books were supposed to die out and be disrupted by some kind of digital replacement. I was assured that they were supposed to be dead by 2015, then 2016, then 2018. I've been involved in at least 4 projects with publishers where at the beginning the talk has all been about digital first or maybe digital only. I've also been in meetings where sales representatives who go and talk to the teachers in their countries have begged the publishers to say, we're not ready for this, people can't, we still need print books. And yet, in some cases, the company would forge ahead, spending lots and lots of money on a digital solution that would replace books, only to then go back and do the books. As the author Dorothy Zemak pointed out in last year's IATEFL plenary, there was a year when one of the big publishers showed up to IATEFL with no books at all, only screens. My part in this, a colleague and I set up an independent e-book self-publishing initiative in 2011. People told me, and I dared to believe it, that it was part of a huge revolution, that I was cresting the wave, and that we were taking on the big corporations, and soon we would disrupt them in the next 5 years. If you don't know the initiative I'm talking about, safe to say that that hasn't been the case. It was called The Round, and there's my colleague and I enthusiastically in 2013 thinking, here we are, disrupting everything. Books always seem to be poised to be disrupted, and yet it hasn't happened. I'm sorry, I just don't believe that it's around the corner anymore. So there are a few problems with the disruption story. First of all, there tends to be the free and easy use of the word disruption. It's a kind of cool word, and so it's easy to attach it to anything you want to make it sound new and revolutionary. And so the people who coined disruptive innovation as a term are increasingly dismayed how it's being used to market almost anything. It's also something that is cast as always on the horizon, always just around the corner. No, we'll get there, they'll get there. Poised for disruption is such a frequent phrase and talking points about EdTech that I think it could almost be considered now a semi-fixed expression. More importantly and damaging is I think that it casts technology as an inevitable thing, like a natural phenomenon, like the weather. This, like the digital immigrant, digital native story, I think ultimately disempowers people, and especially teachers. But we do have a choice here. A teacher who decides to create and use a Kahoot in class, that's the teacher's choice. Offering a language class online is the institutional choice. Insisting that all schools in the country have tablet computers in the hands of students by year X is a policy choice. But so is banning mobile phones in classrooms, as is what happened in France in 2018. So is forcing websites to be more clear and transparent about the data they use, such as what happened with the European GDPR initiative. And so is the eventual, I believe, regulation of the big tech companies and social media. People have agency here. The disruption story, I think, can best be summed up by the words, software is eating the world. I hear variations on this, as if it's a huge monster. If this is true, and we are indeed living in a time of extraordinary technology change, then to quote Audrey Waters again, I think it's very important for us to look at who is telling the story, who is spreading the story, who's benefiting, and what are the counter-narratives. The third and final EdTech story I'd like to address can best be encapsulated by the following tweet from August of 2018. Lots of 2018 stuff happening here. I'll let you read it, and I'll reveal who the tweeter is later. The story that education hasn't changed is another one that I've read, heard, watched, and probably said over the past 10 years. Do you remember when you first heard about TED Talks? TED Talks, everyone is familiar with TED Talks, perhaps. Well, if you are familiar with TED Talks, the chances may have been that you saw Sir Ken Robinson's famous TED Talk, Do Schools Kill Creativity? A wonderfully delivered talk. But he also makes references to how schools haven't changed, how they are stuck in an industrial, factory mode of education. Here's one of the things that he said. Here's another example, again from a TED Talk by Anat Agarwal. Education really hasn't changed in the past 500 years. And finally, the last one was on the variation on this story was also told at an IATEFL conference back in 2014 when Sugata Mitra came to address a conference, and he also included in his talk part of that same story. I myself was actually a very enthusiastic follower of some of this stuff when I started reading and first paid attention to it. Like the digital natives and digital immigrant story, it seemed to instinctively make sense. Unfortunately, the more I started thinking about it, reading about it, and hearing what other people had to say, the more I found it problematic. It's not entirely true, and it's almost always used as a pretext to put more technology into education. Professor Martin Weller at the Open University in the UK has provided an excellent counter-narrative, counter-argument to the education hasn't changed in 100 years. He likens it to a similar argument you might make about reading, which I think is worth looking at. He says, imagine it was stated that reading hasn't changed since the time of Dickens. You could look at this as if it were true and take a photo of someone reading a book and show it to Dickens, take it back in time. He would probably say, wow, reading really hasn't changed. The first question Weller says then to ask is, why would you want reading to change? Why is an absence of change deemed to be a bad thing? Maybe the fact that it hasn't changed in 150 years is a testament to its value, not a sign of its weakness. He then says, but the next aspect to look at is why that statement, while true, is also false. There are differences. There have been significant changes in reading and technology. There are e-readers, but there are still books. The publishing industry has changed a lot, and the context has changed for reading. We read alongside television, internet, gaming, etc. So any statement that says reading hasn't changed since the time of X doesn't realize that reading now is still very different from reading before. So if we take that to the industrial schooling argument, we see a similar pattern. There are stories, there are similarities between schools now and education 100 years ago. But that unchanging thing might be a testament to its resilience. If you want to educate all the children in a country, regardless of age and background, you need a good system. And so one system that has survived might be that it's a good thing, or that alternatives aren't viable. And also, is that statement really correct when we sort of say, well, yes, education hasn't changed, it's so old-fashioned and so on. There are things that have changed. Professionalization of teachers has increased. There's more access to education than there was 100 years ago. There's more access to resources, and there's technology as well. And again, we need to look at who is telling the story and who is benefiting the story. All of these arguments, what they have in common is that they are linked often to a desire to upgrade schools, to get more hardware and more software in them. And according to some writers, such as Audrey Waters or Neil Selwyn, writing from the University of Monash, this narrative is also used to move the control out of the hands of labor, the teachers, and into the hands of the engineers, which often means privatization. The tweet that I showed you, I forgot to mention the tweeter. Oh, sorry, it's not a new argument either. This is a book from 1968, a wonderful book called Teaching Machines and Program Instructions. Look at the back blurb, which I'll read to you. Outside the school, the modern world entices young people with television, radio, films, and tape recorders. Inside, too often, the age of Dickens survives, and tired teachers prefer chalk and talk to oversized classes. So, I was saying about that tweet. The tweet was Betsy DeVos, the billionaire secretary for education in the Trump administration, who I think it's fair to say is certainly more interested in getting education out of the public sphere. In fact, the education budget tabled by that administration just last month wanted to remove $7 billion from the federal public education budget. So, just saying. A curious thing to mention about technology disrupting education or education publishing, and I think it's been touched on at this conference already by at least one other speaker, is how often big initiatives in tech that relate to language teaching don't always accompany a really bold new methodology. If we look outside of ELT, or at least a bold methodology for what I would consider as a teacher or teacher trainer, many of the biggest names in language learning outside of conferences like these in technology are things like Duolingo, Babel, Memrise. These are well-designed, attractive apps that lots of people enjoy, including myself. And yet, the methodology of these is discrete item-focused. It's lots of gap fills. It's restricted practice. There's only one right answer. It leans on translation. The sentences are decontextualized. I really like the sentence that I'm translating into Portuguese there. I do not like people. I do not like people. There's more focus on form than on use. There's a great website, by the way, called WTF Duolingo that you could Google, which has lots of their decontextualized sentences. And while I know that many of us, and I would be the first to say that these are all super important parts of language learning, but they're not the only part, and that's the only thing that they offer. They are important, but it's not groundbreaking, it's not new. And in a way, it's like the methodology has kind of gone backwards. Remember Second Life? Around 10 years ago, this was the big promise for all of us. Like Second Life, that was going to be utterly transforming classrooms. And in ELT, there were some really good initiatives. If you remember Second Life and you were in there, the British Council had excellent Second Life islands for teens. The Consultants E had set up some really interesting Second Life classroom learning spaces. But many of the virtual classrooms that started getting done in Second Life started to look an awful lot like real classrooms, and real uncomfortable ones at that. Sure, this may be just outside of the screen. There were pink skies and whatever, but look at how uncomfortable those seats looked. And they're often a variation on a lecture hall. Or let's look at MOOCs, the massively open online courses. These were touted as replacing the old-fashioned sage on the stage model of education. But if we look at a large part of the actual input in a MOOC, it's done via video lectures. So we get rid of, and the video lectures, not all of them, but lots of them, are essentially sage on the stage, but now it's sage on the screen. So it's not really advanced, a kind of new communicative methodology, at least, in terms of their methodology. The education policy writer Larry Cuban has written a lot about these examples, and he calls them regression to the mean, which is a fancy way of saying that any complex changing situation, extreme outcomes tend to be followed by more moderate ones. Okay, that's a mouthful. I prefer to call it the Animal Farm effect from the Orwell novel, where the pigs wanted to set up a society where walking on 4 legs is good, while walking on 2 legs is bad, until the end they begin walking on 2 legs themselves. One thing EdTech has been great at, really good at, is using all the right words to portray these initiatives, even though they might be, in some cases, unoriginal, not or new, or as desirable as we might think. This is especially true for ELT. Take, for example, the word interactive. For me, as a language teacher or teacher trainer, interactive means learners communicating with each other. But interactive has slowly become co-opted as a term for students interacting with software. The Norwegian scholars Huxback and Notville did a study in the late 1990s, as far back as then, that found that almost every piece of technology in education was being labeled interactive. According to their analysis, this term was perfect for marketers, as it had a range of positive connotations and no commonly accepted specific meaning, even though the interactive whiteboard in the end turned out to be a tool primarily used for presenting. I think another recent example of this has been personalization. Personalization in ELT means using language to talk about your knowledge, experience, and feelings. I've gone to lots of workshops at conferences like this about personalizing your course books, about putting the me in meaningful, and so on. The influence of humanistic approaches, and more recently approaches such as dogme, have placed a big focus on personalizing language to people in the room. But personalization has also become a term in education technology used by proponents of adaptive learning software to mean adapting the course content to individual learners on the basis of their past performance, usually tests. There is nothing personal about it in that sense. We could add to this list the word gamification, which has also been very popular at conferences and workshops over the past 5 years. It appeals, of course, because it contains the word game in it, and who doesn't like a game? Games have been popular in our field for decades. Of course, even proponents of gamification will point out it's not really exactly about games, but rather about applying elements of games, such as points, competitions, and badges, in order to promote more engagement. I know that I'm speaking very quickly about each of these things, and I'm sure there have been great talks about how people have successfully gamified their courses or lessons. But I believe it's another recent example how the language of education technology is very amenable to ELT, and why it makes so much sense we would find it very attractive. So, I only had a certain amount of time this morning, and I had to make choices about which stories that I wanted to share. There are other stories we could talk about. For example, the story of flexible anytime, anywhere learning, which conveniently sidesteps the anytime, anywhere teaching that might have to accompany it. Or stories such as the knowledge economy, that we are transitioning into a knowledge economy, where the reality might be more a service economy. Or the stories that robots or algorithms are coming for our jobs. In the future, I would love to hear either critical analysis of how this is playing out in ELT, how these stories are playing out and what we are doing. Now, while I have been focusing on the stories that EdTech tells, it's not like we are completely innocent of telling stories ourselves in ELT. We have our own stories and our own myths about how our profession has changed or what threatens it. Based on my experience as a teacher trainer, I can think of 3 older myths in ELT. The first one is the myth regarding our history of language teaching, and that we have a series of methods that line up in neat historical order, with one method replacing another. On teacher training courses, these are often blown through in an input session. As Scott Thornbury writes in his book, one of his latest books, 30 Teacher Training Methods, I'll let you read his quote. To be fair, Thornbury goes on to challenge why this narrative isn't necessarily true. But often in input sessions, we learned that back in the dark days, there was grammar translation, then the oral approach, then audiolingualism, and as we move into the light, we get the communicative approach, and along the way, we get some weird things like TPR or Suggestopedia. A part of this shorthand history makes the case that behaviorism as a theory of learning was discredited and then replaced, and that other approaches based on behaviorist theories of learning are seen as relics of a former era and generally had been replaced by something better. I think this narrative then is in direct conflict with lots of the popular language learning apps and technology that very much follow behaviorist principles. Today's apps and programs are designed to demand our attention. They reward us for the desired behavior. They're also very needy. How many of you have had Duolingo? If you've had Duolingo and you give up on it for a little while, it gets really upset and it blows up your phone with notifications like, come back, here, have an extra heart, here, come back, do this, do that. The term for this in Silicon Valley is behavior design. B.F. Skinner, one of the fathers of behaviorism, invented one of the first teaching machines back in the 1950s. And I think a big part of today's EdTech in Silicon Valley can trace its origins back to that. The second narrative, or rather threat, that I want to teach on is the whole bugbear of the backpacker teacher. This is the idea that ELT should become more professionalized and teachers should be more knowledgeable of language, methodology, and so on. The backpacker teacher is widely thought of as an undesirable thing in ELT. He or she may be a nice young person, but doesn't know about English and doesn't know anything about teaching. At best, they can only provide the human nurturing side or a communicative conversation class. Incidentally, the backpacker teacher often is all wrapped up uncomfortably with the native speaker teacher model being the most desirable model, regardless of training. And this too is something we are struggling with in our profession. If this indeed is something that we wish to avoid, it's hard to reconcile this with this view that technology, the internet, or algorithms can take on the heavy lifting of teaching and leave the caretaking, nurturing human side to the teacher. I think if we take that idea to its logical conclusion, it will actively encourage deprofessionalization of teachers or the need for them to know much about language or learning, since the tech will do it all. I think it's the conflict between these two ideas that led so many people to be upset at Sugata Mitra's talk and his idea of support teachers for his school in the cloud. In that view, the learning was done by the learners themselves via the internet, and the teacher was beamed in remotely. But more importantly, in that paradigm, the teacher did not need to have much training apart from being a person who could take care of the caretaking, nurturing side and encouraging the students. In fact, in that view, could be done by retired ladies, and it was called grannies in the cloud. To me, this immediately brought back the backpacker native speaker teacher who can do conversation classes, has great social skills, but only needs to charge €3, £, an hour. The third and final narrative in ELT that I want to touch on is that, by and large, the story we tell is that teachers always teach too much grammar. We always talk about the old-fashioned teacher. I don't want to be an old-fashioned teacher. I don't want to do that old-fashioned teaching method because it focuses too much on teaching grammar. The Common European Framework, which has had an immense effect on our profession over the past 10 years, was supposed to push the boundaries of language teaching away from overt focus on discrete items of language, such as grammar points and word lists, to make us think more about what people can do with the language. And yet, as I mentioned before, many of the programs or apps or automated language learning solutions focus almost exclusively on discrete item knowledge. They focus on grammar points and vocabulary. I've not seen a personalized, interactive, gamified bit of software that can really do speaking or writing or fluency. So, how do these narratives in ELT clash with elements of LX technology? These are some of the areas I've been struggling with recently. I'll just recap them. If, as a profession, we left behind or replaced old-fashioned methods, how do we deal with the fact that so much of language education technology follows elements of these same methods? If a problem in ELT is untrained practitioners who teach by virtue of their native language, how do we deal with arguments that tech can deal with much of the professional bits of teaching, or that teachers are not necessarily beyond a nurturing role? If we think it's not so good to teach so much grammar and vocabulary, how do we deal with adaptive learning technology that needs to test discrete item knowledge in order for it to work? The purpose of this talk was to look critically at the language around education technology as it's manifested itself over the past 10 years, and see where there may be pressure points and conflict with what we believe language teaching should be about. Before we finish, I should be the first to admit that I myself have read, repeated, and probably leaned on some of these stories myself. These myths are problematic now, I think, and in and of themselves. They conflict with some of the things that we believe ELT should be, but I think it's more important than that. I think they fail to serve us well when they diminish the importance of the teacher or make the teacher seem to be at fault. Larry Cuban has written extensively about a rich history in education technology of blame and train. From the attempts to introduce shortwave radio into classrooms, to television, to computers, to the interactive whiteboards, to the internet, to mobile phones, and to tablets, there's often a belief voiced at one point or another that it's the teacher's fault, and that it wasn't not mentioned that it perhaps wasn't the right context for the technology, or the technology wasn't the right technology for that task. Viewed in this way, the stories and language about EdTech that I've been talking about aren't only problematic, they're hurting us. The first thing I'm trying to do now more when I look at education technology, and I'm still a fan of using technology, is that I'm trying to look at it not just in terms of the future or what's coming next or what's happening afterwards. I'm becoming more interested in what happened before, the history, and why things haven't worked. There's another possibility of what I'm doing, is that I may have fallen into another trap. That's because I think there's a new growing story that's happening, and I think we're beginning to enter a new phase of our relationship with technology. The optimism and utopia of Amazon, Google, and Facebook, when they came about at the beginning, is now being replaced by much more balanced and even negative coverage. How many of you secretly wish sometimes that you weren't on social media? Many technology journalists call now what is happening the techlash, a backlash against Silicon Valley and the tech companies that have grown enormous. And we're beginning to see it too in EdTech with headlines such as these. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why I was been thinking this way, because I'm beginning to become aware that there's a backlash beginning to happen. It's probably too early to tell if this will have a meaningful effect on dulling the enthusiasm for technology in our field, but it might. Here are some other dispatches from the techlash over the past year or two. How Tim Berners-Lee, the man who created the World Wide Web, has regrets. How Steve Jobs never wanted us to use our iPhones like this. When the tech mythology collapses. These are just headlines that I've picked at, been collecting over the past year. Social media is rotting democracy from within. It's pretty easy to talk instead. French students talk about the French phone ban and the backlash against screen time at school. IATEFL invited me to give this talk as an exercise in critique. At the very least, everything I said you should treat as an open question. Please let me restate, this is not a critique of your tech project, your tech passion, or your implementation of technology here. This is more a talk about thinking about the language we use and the stories we tell about technology. It's stories and myths that are being used to justify or push for change. I think we need to be realistic about technology and its potential, but I think we equally need to be realistic about what it isn't and what it can't do. Some of these stories aren't just wrong. They may be hurting us. I think that history can help us here. I think that context matters, and I think that we do have agency. I'd like to finish by sharing a quote from a teacher. I gave a practice version of this talk to a closed group of teachers from the British Council, and one of them, Kirk Moore, wrote to me, and he said the following, which I thought was a really nice reflection. He says, "Maybe it's like surfing. I wonder if the best that we can do is surf on the waves that are carrying us. With a little luck, we become aware of them as the swell starts to lift us up, and maybe we can even stand on a board and get a better look around us and influence where they take us." Thank you very much.